Welcome, everyone. For those of you who are new to our research seminar or who are joining us online, my name is Harold Trinkunas. I'm the Deputy Director here at CSAC. It's a pleasure today to welcome one of our fellows, Dr. Ramzy Mardini, who will be speaking on his book project entitled Hostile Takeover, How ISIS Monopolized a Rebellion. Dr. Mardini has been working on this issue closely, including a remarkable field work in the region, in territories formerly controlled by the Islamic State. And he will be speaking to us today about how ISIS acquired a monopoly over the rebellion that they came to lead following 2014. He, in addition to being a fellow here at CSAC, he's an associate at the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts at the University of Chicago. He also received his PhD and MA from the University of Chicago in political science. Since I know everybody already had access to his bio and the event description when you signed up, without much further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Mardini, and we will have a period for Q&A at the end of his talk.
Thanks, Harold, and thank you everyone for coming today. My topic today is sort of a spin-off on my research, and so this is sort of a side project that is a big part of it, but not completely. So, what I'm looking at here is basically trying to understand how did ISIS sort of take over rebellion. And the reason why I focus on this event is because it is basically the key event for the Islamic State, in the sense that you have a rebellion that was basically monopolized in the span of 3 months, and it is the key development in which it allowed ISIS to have an uncontested control over territory, over a large swath of territory, which basically gave it the territorial basis for a state. So I'm not going to be talking much at all about Syria, about the Syrian side of the Islamic State, because the key development here is what happened in Iraq. And because this is an analytical narrative, if you have any questions or any clarification questions, because there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of actors, please stop me. I'd be happy to sort of address those as we go on. So the question I'm going to start off, basically driving this is, how did this one organization, and regardless of what sort of the media has portrayed about the Islamic State, when the Islamic State actually, when ISIS took over, it represented only 10% of the overall Iraqi rebellion. This was not a large, massive organization. It was quite small. So how did one out of many sort of come to basically accomplish, unprecedented success in administering sort of territory the size of Great Britain? And regarding the field of civil wars, we don't actually have good scholarship on consolidation processes in civil wars. A lot of the scholarship in terms of trying to understand the complexity of rebellions has focused on fragmentation. So it's a new and developing sort of field of inquiry. So what I'm going to be talking today about is a specific type of consolidation, which is the hostile takeover. The field research was quite extensive. I first began in 2014. Actually, I began years before that. Before grad school, I was a conflict analyst in the region. But I was present when ISIS took over in Iraq, and I have continued, and it's the same year I started grad school, and so I have been doing that ever since. Every year from 2014 to 2022, across multiple countries. And for this specific topic, these are the countries that I focused on. The countries that I focused on for the larger research was more expansive. But for this topic, these are the key actors that I've interviewed, hundreds of interviews over this course of period of time. Many of the key actors were interviewed multiple times across many years, sort of to try to tease out basically the story of how this all happened. And this included rebel leaders, tribal leaders, the Iranian-backed militias, as well as, the military, intelligence, and security establishments for both the Kurdistan regional of Iraq, Kurdistan regional government of Iraq, as well as the Iraqi government, as well as civilians that have key eyewitnesses in particularly Mosul. Mosul is the key event, as I'm going to get onto later. So what is the Islamic State? The Islamic State is a self-declared separatist state, and it declared itself in June 29 of 2014. It lasted up until 2017 in Iraq, and then on the Syrian side, it lasted until 2019. And at its peak, it's estimated to have 100,000 square kilometers of territory, estimated population between 10 and 12 million. It didn't come out of nowhere. This is sort of the genealogy of it. It sort of was previously known. Obviously, the Islamic State was previously known as ISIS. The U.S. government calls it the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. It's the same thing. But before that, it was ISI, the Islamic State of Iraq, which was founded in 2006. Before that, it was the Mujahideen Shura Council, which was sort of an umbrella of different actors, which in al-Qaeda in Iraq was the main actor, which was sort of born out of the US invasion of Iraq. And the key thing here you want to remember is in the very beginning stages, especially here and here and here, you had a very much a foreign dominated organization. By the time you get to here and, you're talking about a completely local organization with Iraqis staffed in the leadership, mid-level, low level. So it completely became a localized organization over time. This is sort of just an illustration. Again, in Syria, it did not consolidate a rebellion. All this territory that you're seeing here is basically achieved by pushing these other groups out. But in Iraq, it completely swallowed up a rebellion, basically absorbed it in a rapid fashion. That's truly unprecedented in terms of the field of civil wars. So the conventional narrative on the Islamic State is basically, if you're reading about it in the newspapers or in books, it sounds a lot like it was the case of a military victory. The outcome was basically achieved by dominating other groups and eliminating them. And through the use of sort of hard power, soft power, institutional power, like discipline, command and control. The other part of the narrative is a power vacuum, sort of a permissiveness of the environment, basically a breakdown of the Iraqi security apparatus, and it basically filling in that vacuum. So these are sort of the two linchpins of the conventional narrative, which I challenge because there's plenty of problems with it. One, it relies on just really poor and inaccurate data. It doesn't really, not much of the research on the Islamic State has actually been built on field research. You're getting more and more scholars sort of devoting their time on documents and archival work, but it is not a sort of, it's not going to give you at all a full picture of what actually occurred. The other problem is that the effects have been confused as the causes. In other words, because the Islamic State took over, people tend to believe that it must have taken over because it was very militarily strong. When in fact, it was actually a very small group, in comparison to the other Iraqi rebel groups. Obviously, it fails to explain a variation across time and space because the predecessors of ISIS, which also had the same ideology, et cetera, they tried to consolidate the rebellion and it backfired spectacularly. And obviously in Syria, it wasn't able to consolidate the rebellion there. And then, it basically relies on an over sort of simplified and recycled media narrative. And this basically is, if you open a book on ISIS, what you'll read is a very much generic story of the city of Mosul falls and ISIS takes over. There's not much sort of specificity beyond that in terms of how it took over. And in fact, ISIS did not take over Mosul once it fell. The Ba'athists actually had run it for about 3 weeks prior to ISIS taking over. So my argument is that it was a hostile takeover, basically a coup d'etat of the rebel movement. And the reason why this particular consolidation mechanism was viable was because of sort of very specific evolutionary changes in the rebellion. And here I want to sort of lay out 3 of them. And at the strategic level, you have basically, my overall research focuses on basically rebel organization and how it's sort of tied to society. And so what I'm looking at is its degree of embeddedness within society. That to me is what constitutes rebel power. It's not necessarily the amount of guns you have or the size of your forces. It's to what extent is it sort of embedded within this sort of the social context. And this differs from one place to another. You could talk about Lebanese Hezbollah being very strong in specific places. You take that same group and put it in another area that it's displaced from, it's not going to have the same level of capabilities. So what I'm looking at is evolution on these three sort of different levels. One is the political aim, whether or not there's an alignment between the organization and society on terms of political aims of the rebellion. Sometimes this doesn't match. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, ISIS's predecessor, for example, wanted to develop an emirate as sort of a separate state-like entity within Iraq. The population found this to be sort of a foreign idea because the population at that time were Iraqi nationalists. They had not sort of evolved to a point where actually believing in Sunni autonomy. They actually did not even conceive of themselves as part of a Sunni collective identity. The Sunni collective identity is at the operational level. So you need to have a sort of a sense of which the group is considered or perceived as a subset of society. And obviously the tactical level is social networks. To what extent is the organization share the same sort of kinship ties with society, the same sort of friendship ties, or are there actually already networks of established trust there? Obviously this will vary from place to place. In some places, the organization is displaced from society. In other places, it's very much endogenous to it. So I separate basically, there's two rebellions. One actually occurred after the US invasion of Iraq, 2003 to 2008. The second rebellion it kicked off in 2013. And so, all these 3 things sort of evolved between the first and the second. So the context of rebellion had changed between the first rebellion and the second rebellion. Obviously, the ISIS had basically become more local. That was sort of one sort of set of evolution. The second is society evolved. Society became sort of more in terms of confessional, especially regarding the Sunni community. Before 2003, if you asked a Sunni Iraqi, how would they describe themselves? Nobody would say that they're a Sunni. They would say that they're an Iraqi and then they're Arab. The idea of a Sunni collective identity did not exist. So it took some time for this to be created, for this sort of communal ethnic group to be created. And it was born out of sectarianism, basically the civil war that occurred between 2005 and 2007 in Iraq. By the second rebellion, this had already been formed, which creates sort of a social base that al-Qaeda in Iraq did not have in the first rebellion. This was this was very pivotal for ISIS to basically ground itself within the Iraqi rebellion as a group that Iraqis themselves perceived as one of theirs versus some foreign entity. And then part of the system, and I'll get to this later, the bifurcation of political aims. So the first rebellion was basically a rebellion of liberation. By the time the second rebellion happened, there was actually a split. It was a bipolar world. Part of the rebellion wanted to secede, which is led by ISIS, and part of the rebellion wanted to settle and bargain with the government. So this is sort of like just a typology. So it's important in terms of center seeking because I'll get to that later, but basically ISIS and the Baathists, and I'll get to the Baathists later, but basically the two sides, despite being secession seekers and bargain seekers, both masqueraded as center seekers. They had private aims, but in public, they all sort of sought to overthrow the government. And I'll get to that later in terms of the story. But here's sort of in terms of what the different sort of groups that existed at the time. And here you have the first rebellion and then the second rebellion in terms of their political aims evolving over time. So ISIS basically, as you can see here, basically all of them are revolutionary and expulsion. That means they wanted to overthrow the government and they wanted to expel US forces from Iraq. That was sort of the main drivers of rebellion in this set. In this set, you have just a split mainly between settlement and secession. And so this is sort of the convergence. The convergence sort of typology that so in terms of strategic is political, this is collective identity, and this is obviously social networks. And this here is basically al-Qaeda in Iraq. This is basically all they had in terms of mobilizing the population. The Iraqi Sunni community did not consider them as one of their own. The only way they can mobilize the population is through ideology and basically radical ideology, basically the local Salafi community within Iraq. ISIS, however, was able to basically have a huge chunk of the population very much committed to Sunni nationalism. So a huge chunk of the population actually did sort of align with a political aim to secede. And obviously the Iraqi Sunni community was now viewed ISIS as one of their own. And this sort of allowed it to sort of expand to sort of different sort of social networks within Iraq, including ties with ex-military, as well as tribes, and so forth. So it was much more of an embedded organization versus its predecessor, al-Qaeda in Iraq, in the previous rebellion. And so now I just want to go through the sort of the different phases of the hostile takeover. So what this is about is basically it's a coercive acquisition. Think about in terms of a corporate business model in which you are basically trying to take over an entity that does not necessarily want to be taken over. So, so how does that basically work? And here are the 5 phases, but I want to just make sure that the real hostile takeover sort of starts here. This is sort of building up to it in terms of like preconditions. So just a little background of what's going on. At this time, there is, national elections have occurred in April. There is no government yet. And the current Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, is going for a 3rd term. He gains a plurality, but is not able to actually form a government yet. Negotiations were ongoing. So what ends up happening is that the rebellion ends up overlapping with national politics. The rebels, especially in terms of the bargainers, those that are seeking a settlement with government, are trying to basically leverage the rebellion to get the Iraqi government to make specific concessions to the Sunni community. And so this sort of becomes part of the 1968 plan. This plan is basically referring to the 1968 coup in Iraq, where the Baathists took over. And this is basically a plan in which it starts off with as co-conspiracy, but ends up in betrayal. Basically, the Baathists collaborate with key members within the regime to overthrow the government. And after 13 days, they do a second coup to overthrow the collaborators. So this is sort of what the Baathists had in mind with regards to ISIS. We will use them to get our concessions, and then once we get the concessions, we'll flip and backstab ISIS. So this is sort of what is going, and ironically, this is actually what ISIS is thinking with regards to Baathists. So they are both mutually dependent. The secession seekers, ISIS, and in terms of bargain seekers, I'm just going to use Baathists from now on, just to make it simpler. But there's plenty of groups under that umbrella. The secession seekers basically need the Baathists because they don't have the capacity to achieve their political aim, which is seceding from government. They need 90% of the rebellion, the rest of the 90% of the rebellion, to actually clear territory in order for them to declare a Sunni state. The Baathists, on the other hand, needed ISIS for coercion. Without them, they weren't able to leverage the Iraqi government to give them what they want. So each side intends to backstab the other, but they both pretend that they're going for the same goal in order to sort of, hide their private intentions, obviously. So the key for this sort of alliance is who gets the first mover advantage to defect from the other. And the thing about the commitment problem is there wasn't much of a commitment problem between these two sets of groups, which is completely, it's apples and oranges. And the reason why is because both of them intended to defect against the other. So there's no sense in terms of trying to come up with a way in securing commitment to basically act in good faith. So this is a situation in which this was very much primed to implode. Then we get sort of to the next phase, which is the fall of Mosul. And this is completely unintended and unexpected. I've talked to basically everyone from ISIS leaders to Iraqi intelligence. There is nobody that believed that Mosul would fall. It was sort of a fluke event. And I can, if anyone's interested, I can get into why that occurred. But it basically, once that happens, and Mosul is the second largest city of Iraq, this is a city of 2 million people, it snowballed and basically created a huge panic. And you had 5 divisions of the Iraqi army disintegrate overnight in 24 hours, which created basically a wide open space. Basically, the rest of the Sunni territory in Iraq and northern and central Iraq was basically wide open. The effect of this is that it accelerated the timetable to defection, because the Baathists were expecting a very long rebellion where international pressure would build on the Iraqi government to give concessions and allowing them to flip against ISIS. Nevertheless, and I was in Iraq during this time interviewing basically the key players, each side basically thought that they benefited from the fall of Mosul. The Baathists thought this huge calamity is going to really basically put so much pressure on the US and the Iraqi government to basically give us the concessions that we're asking for because they need us to fight ISIS. They claim that they knew where their leaders were. Obviously, they have a tacit alliance with ISIS, so that they actually knew they would have actually been very good counterinsurgents from that standpoint. And it's also a method that the U.S. military has done in the previous rebellion, where it actually worked with moderate rebels flip them and then to work against al-Qaeda in Iraq. So this is not a model that was different. The key difference is that back then, they flipped against al-Qaeda in Iraq for the promise of concessions to be delivered, which were never delivered. This time around, they made sure that they were only going to flip once the concessions were delivered. So there's a bit of a learning curve that actually influences a lot. But in the end, the relationship, which is basically symmetric at the time, turned asymmetric in favor of ISIS. And I'll get into the reasons why, but this is sort of where the hostile takeover now begins. This is sort of the entrapment phase. And what we have is that on June 12th, which is about a couple days after the fall of Mosul, ISIS commits the largest atrocity has committed up to date at that point. And it slaughters 1,700 Shia recruits at a place called Camp Speicher, which is near the town where Saddam grew up. And from the media perspective, it was a humanitarian catastrophe. But in fact, it was a strategic decision made by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, along with his military strategist. At least 15 out of these, at least 15 tribes were affected in the south, Shia tribes. And what this ends up doing is it creates a massive revenge campaign. It mobilizes, I mean, you talk about the militia problems today in Iraq. This is why there's so many militias in Iraq and why it's such a huge, huge problem. They existed before, but this has really sort of compounded the issue by tenfold. You had tens of thousands of new Shia militia recruits, all sort of bent on revenge. And what this also ended up doing was it spoiled negotiations for the Baathists in Baghdad. So the Baathists were negotiating with Baghdad via their Sunni political elites in order to extract Sunni concessions. This basically just sort of completely spoils those negotiations because now you have heightened sectarian tensions boiling. So it basically cuts off any exit ramp for the bargainers to leave the rebellion. ISIS knew that each side also knew that they also intended to backstab the other. So they basically preempted and spoiled the ability for the bargainers to leave the rebellion. And there was a lot of sort of, within ISIS, there was a lot of disagreement about what to do with these 1,700. Some of them wanted to trade them in for prisoners released from Baghdad, particularly militant prisoners. But it was made, a strategic decision was made to actually execute them, and not just execute them, but to videotape it and release it immediately. So this is sort of what really, changed the dynamics of the rebellion. So then you get to the next stage. And this is in large part due to ISIS's basically its ability to have a robust informant network, which would have not been possible had it not been had it not evolved into an Iraqi organization. So because it became an Iraqi organization with basically from top down, it was able to also leverage much of its social ties within society to create a very robust intelligence apparatus. And it was able to leverage this because it targeted the political and military leaders of its rival rebels almost within a span of a month. We're talking about assassinations and kidnappings and so forth. And the Ba'athist leadership, especially their operational leadership, was ambushed in the middle of the road. And so then they sort of leveraged this and they blackmailed the top Ba'athist leader, who was Saddam Hussein's vice president, and the king of clubs. If you remember the invasion of Iraq, the U.S. military had put a bunch of these people on a playing deck, and so he was the king of clubs. They basically blackmailed him to give public support to ISIS. This is a way to discredit him in front of his followers. So So right now, we have entrapment. So basically cutting off any exit option for the rebels to flip sides. And then you had a decapitation of the leadership. And so then you have the final sort of stage is where basically it sort of is like a tender offer to like, if you're thinking about corporate business, of a hostile takeover, you bypass the board of the corporation that you want to take over, and you make a tender offer to the shareholders. And in this case, the shareholders being the rank and file, as well as the social basis of those other rival rebel organizations. And the tender offer is like, we will not eliminate you. If you repent and disarm, you can join us. The reason why they had an incentive to join is because they had this huge militia threat right on the horizon, building up day after day, about to invade Sunni areas and go on a mass killing spree. So, and then they also have no leadership to turn to because they've been decapitated. So they have no other way to go other than to join ISIS for protection. So that is sort of like the mechanism that sort of ISIS employed. This is sort of like the key sort of step by step. So it led to a mass absorption on a mass scale. This is why, like, you would hear during a time, ISIS goes from an organization of 2,000 people in June to the end of the summer. You have the CIA estimating its forces well into the tens of thousands, over 30,000. And people are wondering, how is this possible? It's because of this. They basically swallowed the rest of the rebellion in one go. So the implications regarding this is like, well, it's the fact that you can't really think of coercive power in terms of its ability to go from one place to another without understanding its embedded environment. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was a powerful organization in terms of military and financial support, but it was displaced from the local population. It wasn't able to mobilize the population in terms of its political goals or its ideology. In fact, most Sunni Arabs at the time did not think of themselves as Sunnis. They kind of sort of looked at ISIS as this foreign entity that but obviously that changed over time. And the other part is like the intersection of rebel politics and rebel strategy. We really don't have a good understanding of how rebel politics comes into rebel strategy. Usually when you think about strategy, it's about military effectiveness on the battlefield. When in fact, these groups are not just, armed entrepreneurs. They're politicians with guns, and they manipulate the environment in ways that can sort of, help achieve its goals. And then there's the other aspect is sort of like, contributing to sort of the advancement of our understanding of consolidation and civil wars. Right now, our basic understanding is that consolidation happens as groups get eliminated from military defeats. There's no really, it's an under-theorized area because there's also mergers and acquisitions. There's other ways in which consolidation can occur that we simply don't understand. It's a relatively new sort of field of inquiry that scholars are finally now beginning to pay attention to. The other thing is, like, in terms of like threat and intelligence assessments, there was no real intelligence assessment at the time to, if you remember, President Obama calling ISIS the JV team in January 2014. There was no intelligence assessment at the time to conceive of this small organization then becoming sort of this huge state-like entity. The same thing can be said for the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan. The 6 to 18-month time frame that was considered the time in which the Taliban would take over was driven by a model of military contestation, whereby you have these two sort of different armies competing with each other. It did not occur that there would be a mass co-optation mechanism that would suddenly flip that, in a matter of days. So it's important to understand that there's different pathways in which you can get a consolidated rebellion. And we simply only are focused on one particular type of model, which is the domination model. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, happy to answer them.
Fantastic. We have a good amount of time for Q&A. So just as a reminder, one finger to get on the queue, two fingers to jump in on the matter of hand. Please introduce yourself and your affiliation when you're called on. As per tradition, we'll go to our fellows first for a couple questions. Please ask your best question. And if you have additional questions, that's fantastic, but we'll put them at the end of the queue and so we can keep going. So first, let's see if there's any fellows. Got Josh and Hannah, and then we'll open up the rest of the list.
Thank you for your presentation today. I'm Josh Glonick. I'm a visiting scholar, Army officer here at CSAC. One of the things that ISIS did fairly impressively beyond their initial military force, they were able to provide other forms of governance, the provision of public goods and services, they collected taxes, distributed resources, etc. So I'm wondering, in terms of your theory of their ability to very rapidly sort of take control, did you consider that, or do you think that had a role in it as well? You can imagine if there's a group, it's one thing for sort of a bunch of armed bandits to come and take over, but it's another thing for an organization that almost looks like they're a new government that's doing these other things that people need in order to survive as a society. Do you think that had a role in how fast ISIS was able to take over initially?
Okay, sorry. Okay. Well, the consolidation phase sort of happened so quickly that it happened prior to really strong governance apparatuses being sort of set up. That came sort of later, and specifically Iraq. In Syria, they definitely had governance going on in terms of in Raqqa province. But other organizations also had sort of pretty good governance apparatus, sort of basically extracting taxes, et cetera, and so forth from other organizations. I think the media sort of played it up a bit too much in terms of how much this was sort of a cause for their military success. I would argue that in Syria they had a lot of problems with governance. In Iraq they were much better, and the reason why is because in Iraq the people, ISIS was a local organization. It could rely on local networks in terms of where are sort of the major threats to us. How do we finance? How do we collect taxes? Yeah, before Mosul fell, there was actually a protection racket happening in Mosul for years, and usually my conversations with civilians there basically looked at to what extent that ISIS was able to sort of embed itself even before taking over the city. Al-Qaeda in Iraq wasn't able to do that because it didn't have many local informants to actually sort of basically run a protection racket in Mosul. ISIS, on the other hand, was able to actually do that very effectively. It was able to go from business to business and know the extent of assets that those businesses had, and was able to sort of come up with a numerical figure of how much you actually owe them. So they knew the local population. They knew, if they had a house in somewhere else, they knew if they had businesses and ties elsewhere. So that they were able to actually do it very effectively in terms of extracting sort of money from the local population, because they were from the local population. Versus Syria, they actually had a very hard time. A lot of it had to be, a lot of it was driven by basically harsh and intimidation and threats in Syria. Iraq was a completely different story. So it did have a role in terms of how embedded the organization was, but in terms of how it basically took over and dealt with other rival rebel organizations, I think it is like a separate sort of question. One is looking at depth. To what extent does the organization have depth in a certain area? And I think the question I'm looking at is more in terms of the horizontal question of how did it sort of consolidate versus these other rival organizations? How did it sort of, defeat them or acquire them, et cetera?
Great. I have Hannah, Rose, Paul, Lisa, Chance, Caleb. So let's go to Hannah next, and then we'll go to Rose.
Yeah, Johanna Roda-Noack, or Hannah for short, as you just heard. I'm one of the international security fellows here at CSAC. I had not necessarily a question, but more a request for clarification or expansion on one thing that probably helped me understand this a little bit more. Is you had this slide with the non-ISIS group in 2014, where I think pretty much all of them wanted to settle in the second. Yes, exactly. And so in the second rebellion, most of them, I think, wanted to settle, and ISIS did not. Still is still in a secession transnational goal. And I was wondering if you could maybe explain a little bit more. Is this why they were? So, firstly, where does this transformation of goals come from the non-ISIS rebel groups? And is your argument that this is one of the reasons for why they were subsumed in the end?
Yeah, I think because if they all had the same goal, I think what ends up happening is that all of them try to achieve the goal and then they start fighting each other. But if you have different goals, then you have different timetables. Who gets to achieve their goal first is the one that's able to go after their rival or their allies. So this is sort of like it creates like the sort of this asymmetry where it's a race against the clock. And the reason why you have the other rebel groups changing is that, well, one, the US military is no longer there in the second rebellion. By the time that the second rebellion starts, it's no longer present. So the idea of a liberation driver is obsolete. The second part is that it takes time for the rebels to finally accept reality. So they lost the first rebellion. They weren't able to overthrow the government. And so by the time the second one came around, they kind of understood that they were the minority. Because again, in the first one, the idea of a minority only counts if you consider yourself a particular ethnic group. The Sunnis did not. They weren't socialized to think this way. Saddam basically used Iraqi nationalism and Arab nationalism as modes of basically governing Iraq, and for good reason, because you don't want to sort of create this because he came from the Sunni community, so you don't want to actually make rigid identity groups, but like they came to the reason like, okay, we are the minority. How are we going to get our rights? Because we're excluded from state and society. We need to figure out a way in which we can sort of gain leverage vis-a-vis the Iraqi government, which was dominated by Shias. So it became a mechanism in which we can join the rebellion, we can start fighting the Iraqi government. In the end, they will need us to counter ISIS, because we've been through this before, and yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
I had Rose next, followed by Paul and Lisa.
Okay, thank you. Ramzy, this is really remarkable field work. Essentially, you had an active ground game in the midst of the crisis as it was unfolding. And as you said, you talked to everybody. Can you talk a little bit more about your research methods? How did you manage that?
So So this wouldn't have been possible had I not been focusing on Iraq for many years, even prior before this. So I already knew the key players before going in. I've been into Iraq before, so it was in a situation in which I was at the right place and right time, starting off. And so I was able to sort of meet with the Ba'athist leadership in the midst of their decision making. They went to great lengths in terms of like telling me what their plans were regarding ISIS and what they wanted the US to do, as well as, and I was able to sort of like come in and basically sit in on debates between the Sunni political elites and what they were going to do as well. And I just simply continued that going forward. That research was prior to, I was starting grad school that fall. So that summer I was already in Iraq. And I had been in Iraq, I mean, I had been in the region for years working for the Atlantic Council as a fellow. So it's a way of, in terms of, you meet with somebody that they already have known you for years. There's already trust established. So you're in a much more advantageous position to actually get a sense of what was going on. And because I have been working on Iraq for a long time, my line of questioning, and they understood that who I was in terms of working on Iraq a long time. So it's easier to basically not only get a sense of whether or not they were telling the truth, but they understood that I also knew the topic as good as well as they did. So it became, it came sort of relatively easy to sort of like peel the onion from the beginning. And then I made over 24 trips since then back. And a lot of these key players were interviewed multiple times. So, they knew I was coming back for more questioning as well. So they knew this was an ongoing project in terms of like understanding the motives and what the constraints were in terms of their decision making, et cetera. Thanks.
Great. Thanks. If you're online and would like to ask a question, just enter it into the Q&A function in Zoom. But we'll go to Paul next, followed by Lisa and Chance. Paul.
Yeah, I just want to amplify how amazing project and a great talk. I was fascinated by what you said about the the popular press about Sunni versus Shia, and the impression I had at each other's throats for centuries, and this was just another manifestation of that. But you seem to be telling very different stories. I just wondered if you could expand that a little bit.
Yeah, when the US went in 2003, the way it understood Iraq was between these different sort of groups. And, every Iraqi will blame the US for sectarianism in Iraq because of the way in which they perceived the breakdown of society. Now, for the Kurds and Shias, they already had sort of developed an identity, a collective identity. The Kurds obviously have that. And the Shias, the Shia population as well, because of not just sort of their distinct, sort of religious, networks, but also the fact that they were targeted by the Saddam regime, especially after the 1991 uprising. But they were targeted, their religious symbols were targeted, et cetera. They had developed also a sort of an identity, but you have to remember that many Shia were also Ba'athists. There were Kurds that were in the Ba'ath Party. There were Christians in the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party was not only strictly Sunni. They did not sort of emphasize, a Sunni identity. And what the Iraqis would tell you, especially Sunni Iraqis, is that when the US came in, they began to divvy up basically political power based on, the representation of society. the Shias get this many seats, the Sunnis will get this much, the Kurds will get this much. They said that was the beginning of how sectarian politics sort of, the problem with that is like, yes, that is also true, but you also had political actors, particularly the Kurds and the Shia, that actually wanted to reinforce this breakdown. Because the Shias knew that they were the majority, and so this was a way in which they can sort of undermine the Ba'ath Party by basically playing up their sectarian identity. So you had it going both ways. You had the U.S. going in there, probably driven by ignorance, but you also had these opportunistic players within the Shia community, as well as the Kurdish community, that actually wanted to reinforce these sets of identities. And by the way, the U.S. military and the U.S. administration, the George W. Bush administration, was relying a lot on exiles from Iraq who came specifically from the Shia community and the Kurdish community. So a lot of, and they happened to also be, many of them had also happened to be, not just secular but Islamist as well. So there was a sense in which we went in with kind of listening to a selective sort of slice of the pie, and it basically really sort of worked to push sectarianism in Iraq in a really dangerous way.
Ramzy, can you check your mic to make sure it's on? We're getting the screen.
It's off.
I think it's the folks online can't hear.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, yeah.
All right.
So let's go to Lisa next.
Okay, thank you for an amazing talk. It was really wonderful to hear about your research. I wanted to make one quick comment on the previous question. Just two pieces of empirical evidence. Right after the US invasion, people went to survey levels of interpersonal trust among different groups, and actually the Sunni level of interpersonal trust was the lowest of any of the sectarian groups at that point in time. So there was not a lot of trust that Sunni Muslims had in others in Iraq. The other kind of interesting piece of evidence, I think, is that during the sanctions period, the Anbari Sunnis, the Sunnis from Anbar, actually had the worst economic conditions of anyone in the country. So if you think about, was this a Sunni regime? Actually, child stunting was absolutely the worst in Anbar. They had the highest levels of malnutrition among children. And so we can't really talk about it like a Sunni regime, in the sense that many of the Sunnis were treated quite badly. My question for Ramzy is about a big controversy, I think, in the literature regarding the Ba'athist legacy among the ISIS rank and file and leadership. So I've heard so many people talk about the importance of prior Ba'athists in the group, and others who will absolutely argue against that and say that the Ba'athists did not constitute a critical component of the ISIS leadership and rank and file. I wanted to find out if you had a position on the question about the legacy of Ba'athists in the Islamic State.
Thank you. So yeah, there is a debate going on. I mean, or I don't know if it's going on now, but there was a debate where there was a group of people who blamed, obviously, Saddam Hussein and sort of the faith campaign in the 1990s, where he had to basically gin up, sort of a religious movement to buttress his regime after sanctions and the war in Iran. And basically, this argument is like, it created radicalization in Iraq, and that's where these people come from. Well, my argument against on that is, there had been preceding years before ISIS came to power where there was a rebellion. Sure, there were many, radical, Iraqis and some in the Ba'ath Party did become radicalized. But I think the more important thing is, like, you don't need that many Ba'athists in ISIS to really make a difference. It definitely is a critical component, and based on my interviews from the most knowledgeable people in Iraqi intelligence, as well as ISIS members themselves, it really creates that kind of knowledge infusion, because in the beginning, the Baathists, the ones that joined, were actually kept at a distance. The foreigners did not trust them. It was only over time when the Iraqis had risen through power, basically because the U.S. killed everyone else. So they had to find ways in which basically they had risen through the ranks. Those Baathists were very critical in terms of strategy, in terms of military policy, in terms of understanding Iraq, in terms of understanding how to collect intelligence in Iraq and develop these informant networks. So I would not sort of, my argument is actually a very critical factor based on the people that I talked to. It's not something to sort of dismiss at all.
All right, we're almost out of time, and we have a number of people left on the list. So I'm sure Ramzy will spend a little bit of time afterwards talking to folks in the room, but I want to work in one online question from Professor Katie Robinson at Rice University, also Stanford political science grad. Her question is about how ISIS was able to maintain its cohesions and capabilities while also expanding so quickly. Groups that experience a sudden influx of new members must find ways to screen, train, and organize these recruits effectively. We know from existing work that militant organizations that cannot do this while expanding struggle to maintain internal cohesion and may fragment. So how was IS able to overcome this challenge? What tools, organizational practices did they use to do so?
So so the way ISIS actually recruited people, you had to have two people within the organization to vouch for you. That was the sort of their screening mechanisms that you wouldn't be able to allow to join ISIS unless you. I'm talking about a willing volunteer that approaches ISIS. You would need two people to vouch for you. In areas in which they took over control, that you didn't need to sort of apply that criteria because it is less likely that suddenly a spy would happen to be in an area in which ISIS took over that's waiting to be recruited. So it definitely was a challenge. I would say it was a challenge more in Syria than in Iraq, because in Syria it was a multinational, organization in Syria. Yes, you had Syrians within ISIS, but they were very much, the overwhelming majority of them were at the low level, low level sort of parts of the organization. And the way ISIS sort of had to manage in Syria is they had units specifically, you had a unit that is specifically that's French speaking. And then you had a unit that was specifically, that Russian speaking. So the way they handled cohesion was basically to put all the people that were from that speak the same language in one unit, rather than have them diverse, across the organization. In Iraq, it was almost as if, it was very cohesive in the sense that you had people that all knew each other. It wasn't in the sense of you had like different sort of you definitely had different sort of ethnic groups in Iraq, but they all spoke the same language. They all came from Iraq. They all sort of, so it was let's say, for example, an Iraqi tribal sheikh enters ISIS in Iraq. That person would rely on his tribe as ways of recruitment, so in a sense, cohesion was basically, achieved through social network ties and overlapping ties. In Syria, people did not know other people at all. They came as individuals, a lot of foreign fighters, around over 40,000 foreign fighters. So it was a matter of basically trying to manage that, in trying to create these homogenized groups within ISIS, these military units that all spoke the same language, rather than sort of some the broad sort of architectural cohesion that it actually achieved in Iraq. So there's differences in ISIS in Syria versus Iraq. It's not the same. It's not the same policy. It's not the same sort of characteristics.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but please join me in thanking Dr. Mardini for a fantastic talk.